I'm now joined once again by my colleague Lucas Schoeppner, who helps manage our investment stewardship and engagement activities.
Thanks, Joe. Great to be chatting with you again.
So, Lucas, we know you spend a lot of time on environmental themes. In last quarter, we talked about methane emissions and how they can affect the oil and gas industry. This quarter, we've got some news out of the SEC with released proposed rules around climate reporting. What is all this rulemaking about?
Sure. Well, this proposed rule calls for uniform disclosure of Scope 1 and 2 emissions for most large publicly traded companies in the U.S. So this Scope 1 and 2 emissions means companies' direct emissions and emissions close to that, like things from vehicles run by the company or travel emissions. And the reason why investors care about these emissions is because these standards will make it easier to compare apples to apples between companies when it comes to finding who's operating most efficiently or who's operating with the least carbon footprint. For a lot of companies, they look at these carbon emissions as waste, as energy costs, as overhead that they're looking to cut when they can. So we also hope that this will help investors like Wespath, who might have carbon reduction commitments or net zero commitments, also measure the impact of their own portfolios more accurately. Now, over the past decade, it's become an expectation amongst many investors that companies will disclose their carbon emissions and incorporate climate risk into their business strategy. But what this rule does is kind of set a baseline for companies to report those direct emissions when they're financially material and when external climate risks like flooding or extreme weather events have a big enough potential impact that they're worth reporting to shareholders.
And so, from what we've heard, that these proposed rules have changed a lot since the initial drafts. Do you agree with that?
I do. A lot of advocates from both the investor and NGO space hope that these rules would include mandatory Scope 3 emissions reporting too. Now, Scope 3 emissions means reporting beyond those direct company emissions we talked about a minute ago. So this means things like for a textile manufacturer, the emissions that are in their supply chain upstream, or for an oil and gas company, the emissions that come from the tailpipe of a car. And this is important because, for example, in that oil and gas sector, tailpipe emissions can mean up to 80% of a given company's carbon impact.
And it sounds like there's been a lot of pushback from both sides of the aisle around this proposed rule.
That's right. This rule excludes those reporting requirements on Scope 3 emissions that was in there in some earlier drafts of the rule and was later on taken out. A lot of the investors and advocates who are more focused on climate change were really disappointed to see that that was taken out of the rule. But at the same time, some companies and investors, maybe on the more conservative side of things, are also arguing that climate change and risks around that just aren't something that should be under the purview of the SEC in the first place.
And so, Lucas, what do you think this rule could mean for the companies we invest in and the kinds of disclosures that we see from them?
Well, ideally, it's not going to mean much at all because most of these companies are already reporting their Scope 1 and 2 emissions already. Now, we have seen a lot of what's called for in these SEC rules involve a lot of caveats around materiality. So we'll keep an eye on whether some companies backtrack on that. But for the most part, what's being called for is already being addressed in annual sustainability reports. The truth is that this kind of standard is going to make it easier for Wespath to move on to other engagement priorities just beyond disclosure on things like carbon emissions. And that'll hopefully allow us to better manage risk in our clients' portfolios.
And Lucas, there was some breaking news recently when the SEC announced they would pause the implementation of some of these rules. Companies and trade groups complaining that there was immediate and irreparable harm from the regulations. And you mentioned earlier that there's some concern that they're already overstepping their bounds. So can you comment on this?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, the SEC on April 4th told the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit that it would stay the requirements for public companies in the U.S. to report these carbon emissions and carbon risks that are called for in the proposed rule. But we're hoping that this doesn't have a major impact on the implementation of them. The SEC has never really been on the vanguard of climate disclosure. Their job, in my view, has always been to kind of set the basic standards, set in stone what's already starting to take place. This they've done since 2009, when they started to call for climate risk disclosure in annual reporting. In my opinion, they're setting a floor and not a ceiling, and this is an important role that they play here. And we're skeptical of the supposed harm that these rules would mean for companies because most of this reporting, as I mentioned, has been done for years anyway. And there is still a lot of uncertainty still around what good Scope 3 emissions looks like, those supply chain emissions that we talked about earlier. But we hope this rule will still be implemented, and I think it will help make these climate reporting standards a permanent fixture of reporting in the U.S., and it'll just be consistent with the kind of voluntary sustainability reporting that we've seen in the U.S. over the past 10 years.
And so, Lucas, so one last topic, an exciting one. Can you tell us a bit about the expansion that are coming to the social values choice funds, and particularly for institutional investors and for investors that are preferring an approach that avoids investments in fossil fuels?
Sure. So while we believe keeping our seat at the table and making the Methodist voice heard on issues of climate and policy is really important, we're pleased to announce that the expansion of the Social Values Choice Fund is upcoming. This will come to institutional investors by the end of the year. These funds don't invest in companies that derive a significant amount of revenue from companies involved in the fossil fuel industry. And these enhancements aim to empower participants and organizations served by Wespath to align their investments more closely with their individual values.
It's exciting news. Lucas, certainly thank you for coming today.
Thanks for talking with me, Joe.